Thank you very much, Mary. So what I'd like to do is just give people, I guess, an update as to where things are with the Northern Ireland Protocol. And I suppose in the light of the terrible scenes in Belfast and other parts of Northern Ireland, what impact that might be having on the implementation or outworking of the Northern Ireland Protocol and relations in general between the UK and the European Union since the beginning of the year. I've just actually spent the last few days trying to speed read Michel Barnier's book on his time as Brexit negotiator. The problem is it's in French, which is not a language that I'm entirely fluent in, but with Google Translate, I managed to get through most of it. It's being published tomorrow, and then an English version is coming out in October. But it's a fairly entertaining and at times quite candid look behind the scenes at what life was like for him as the chief EU negotiator during the withdrawal agreement and the future relationship negotiations. I suppose the big issue that dominated the withdrawal agreement was Ireland. People didn't really anticipate that being a major problem before the referendum. It was quite noteworthy that during the campaign in the UK, if the Irish question ever came up, people talked about the common travel area and the fact that people might not be able to move back and forward. But nobody really, well, with the exception of very few people, understood that if the UK, including Northern Ireland, was going to leave the single market and the customs union, then there would have to be some kind of regulatory and customs border on the island of Ireland. So we all know how that became the central and the most difficult issue for first Theresa May and then Boris Johnson afterwards. And it really, I think, blindsided the UK because they hadn't really thought this through. They hadn't prepared their lines on how to deal with the Northern Ireland question. Even though at the beginning of the negotiations, to be fair to the British team and to David Davis and Ollie Robbins and his team, they did agree with the Irish government that they had to protect the Good Friday Agreement. They had to make sure there was no return to what they called the borders of the past, that the peace process should be protected, that the all-Ireland economy should be protected. And in fact, the UK actually agreed with the Irish government that an open border on the island of Ireland was the biggest symbol of the Good Friday Agreement and the peace process. We know now that Britain had hoped to resolve the Irish question through the future trade relationship, but the Irish government and the EU decided that simply put, the UK couldn't be trusted to not use Ireland as a bargaining chip in the future relationship talks. So in other words, the UK wanted to have a close, well, at least under Theresa May, the UK wanted to have a close trading relationship with the EU, frictionless trade and so on. And if they hadn't dealt with Ireland in the withdrawal phase, then the UK could say, well, if you put those trade barriers up to us, then what's going to happen on the island of Ireland? So I think that pushed the UK into very uncomfortable territory. And we saw how difficult it was for Theresa May to deal with, first of all, the joint report, which I suppose sketched out in an embryonic sense, the idea that Northern Ireland would somehow stay aligned to the single market and the customs union. Then she decided to get around that particular problem by having a UK-wide customs union so that Northern Ireland and the UK as a whole would stay in a customs union with the EU until the full trade agreement was resolved. And at that point, according to Theresa May, the free trade agreement would be so close that you wouldn't need to have any checks and controls on the Irish border. Needless to say, all of this was treated with skepticism by the European Union and, of course, her own party. And the withdrawal agreement that she finally negotiated under tremendous pressure in October 2018 was rejected by the House of Commons, as you all know. a lot of this is very graphically told in Michel Barnier's book, which I've just been reading, as I say. And Theresa May ends up as one of the, not a hero of the book necessarily, but I think he has tremendous respect and admiration for how difficult it was for her, given that how difficult it was for her to try and square the circle of Brexit and the Irish border. I mean, at one point, she met him in his office in, well, I think it was Jean-Claude Juncker's office in February 2019. So at that stage, the withdrawal agreement that she negotiated had been concluded with the EU, but it had been rejected at least once by the House of Commons. And at that time, the House of Commons was split between those who wanted a no-deal Brexit, those who supported her agreement, and those who wanted a second referendum. And she told Michel Barnier that the walls were going up everywhere and the doors were being closed everywhere. But he said she is still unsinkable. So some interesting insights there from Michel Barnier on Theresa May, who of course had an unhappy ending as Conservative leader and Prime Minister. Then, of course, she was replaced by Boris Johnson, and he came in guns blazing, saying that the backstop had to be abolished, and he didn't really believe in this idea of the all-Ireland economy, North-South cooperation. He felt that you could have a customs border that would be kind of light touch or seamless or made more efficient by technology. But he was kind of given a rude awakening by the EU in that they simply said to him, we're not accepting a customs border on the island of Ireland. And he was kind of corralled in the end into accepting a border in the Irish Sea, which is something that Theresa May said no British Prime Minister would ever accept. It's something he said he would never accept, but yet he did accept it. And then he went about denying that there would be a border in the Irish Sea, denying that there were going to be any checks or controls. And anyone you talk to now in Northern Ireland who has been following this closely will tell you that that lack of honesty by the UK government at the time that the protocol was revised or renegotiated has made the whole operation of the protocol a lot more difficult, because I think Boris Johnson and other people raised the expectations of unionists that not much would change, and the expectations of businesses in Northern Ireland and businesses in GB that not much would change as a result of the protocol. So after the withdrawal agreement took effect at the end of January 2020, of course, then we had the transition period running up to the end of last year, and then we had the negotiations on the future relationship between Michel Barnier and David Frost. The protocol itself came into effect on the 1st of January this year. Now, all of last year, the UK and the EU were locked in discussions about how to implement the protocol. And of course, the UK was trying all the time to whittle down the degree of checks and controls that they were obliged to implement. They didn't produce a report on how the protocol would be implemented until the end of May of last year. And it meant that the civil service in Northern Ireland and the bodies that would have to actually build the infrastructure at ports, they couldn't really get moving until September of last year. And it meant that nothing was really going to be ready on time on the 1st of January this year. So then, in the meantime, you had Michael Gove, who you all know well, and his opposite number, Maroš Šefčovič, on the EU side, trying to find ways to make the protocol work as well as it possibly could. And they both agreed that there should be some grace periods for supermarkets, for people providing big consignments of food to supermarkets in Northern Ireland. The question of chilled meats, unfrozen meat like sausages, mince, prepared meals, all of those are normally banned from entering the EU from a third country. But the EU agreed to a 6-month derogation of that rule. So In other words, they hoped that supermarkets in Northern Ireland would alter the supply chain, so they would get those kind of foods from the south of Ireland, which would be in the EU, which would comply with EU food safety and animal health regulations and so on. So all of this seemed kind of promising at the end of last year. We had an agreement by both sides. The UK said it was going to keep applying the EU's food safety rules for as long as the grace periods were in place. Then reality struck on the 1st of January and the protocol came into effect. I think the first problem was that a lot of companies in Great Britain didn't realize that they had to make customs declarations, that they had to log with a computer system any consignments of food going to Northern Ireland from Great Britain. They didn't fully grasp that there were other formalities in moving food from Great Britain to Northern Ireland, mainly because naturally they thought it's the same country, why should there be any formalities? Also, they probably thought, well, we've just concluded a free trade agreement with the EU, so why do we need to do anything? But of course, a lot of them were in the dark about what the Northern Ireland Protocol meant. And you had a problem of lots of trucks bringing products from Northern Ireland to Great Britain. And they would normally bring stuff back to Northern Ireland, but they couldn't because they didn't have the right paperwork. So you had stories of trucks being held up for weeks on end. You had the problem then of parcels not being delivered to Northern Ireland. You had the problem of nurseries not able to receive seeds or plants or bulbs, or even farms not being able to receive farm machinery if it had any soil on it, because the soil was no longer soil that was, if you like, approved by the European Union, because it was now, the UK was now a third country. So all of this was a major shock to large swathes of the Northern Ireland population. Ian Paisley Jr. of the DUP said Northern Ireland, Boris Johnson should immediately trigger Article 16 of the protocol and basically abandon the protocol. Michael Gove's view was that this was teething troubles. He, of course, had reached this agreement with Marek Šefčovič in December. So as far as he was concerned, supermarkets had grace periods to adapt to the new situation, and he didn't think it was a problem. Then suddenly, 29th of January, the EU, the European Commission is rushing through legislation that would require companies exporting vaccines out of the EU to third countries, that they'd be required to have an export authorization or a specific license that would allow them to export vaccine doses. Now, we all know the context here. The EU was really having big troubles with its vaccine rollout. It was only, I think, a quarter of the delivery of AstraZeneca vaccines were made. This was causing all sorts of ripple effects across the EU. Ursula von der Leyen, the Commission President, was under extraordinary pressure, especially from Germany and the German media. So they wanted to effectively say, okay, any vaccines being exported out of the EU, if those vaccines should by rights and by contract be going to EU member states, then we have to know where they're going. And of course, the suspicion was that AstraZeneca was producing vaccines, giving them to the UK, but not giving them to the EU. So some bright spark in the European Commission said, well, if we look at the Northern Ireland Protocol, Northern Ireland is kind of regarded as part of the single market. So that means there can't be any export restrictions on anything going to Northern Ireland. But Northern Ireland also has unfettered access to Great Britain. So what happens if vaccines go to Northern Ireland and then cross into Great Britain? So that was why they gave themselves the option of invoking Article 16 of the Northern Ireland Protocol. But what that would have meant in material terms would only have been that if a company in Belgium was exporting AstraZeneca vaccine doses, if they were going to Northern Ireland, they would need the export authorization. They would need the right paperwork. It wasn't the case that the EU was suddenly putting a hard border on the island of Ireland, having spent 4 years promising not to do anything like that or to risk anything that would give rise to a hard border. Anyway, to cut a long story short, that gave the UK an opening, and there was a huge controversy that lasted weeks. And Michael Gove wrote a letter to Maros Šefčovič saying, we demand that the protocol be altered, amended by the end of this week. And you had a huge crisis, and then they tried to kind of patch things up, but in the end, it got back into a process of committee meetings and the EU saying, okay, we can look at how we make the protocol more flexible, and we take the kind of poison out of this and say, let's get back into the joint committee, which effectively manages the protocol. So then in March, the UK unilaterally decided to extend the grace periods themselves. So we can say a little bit about the grace periods now. One of the most onerous parts of the protocol is for supermarkets. If you are bringing huge amounts of food into the European Union from a third country, you need an export health certificate. If it is food of animal origin, which means meat or eggs or dairy, and these products then have to be signed off by a vet. And all of this is to do with traceability and food safety. But how would that apply to Northern Ireland supermarkets who on a daily basis bring huge volumes of food in from distribution centres in the UK? So a Sainsbury's in Belfast or Lisburn or Derry would get huge pallet loads of food every day from Great Britain. Does that mean they all need export health certificates? Does every single item need to be signed off by a vet? These are very difficult issues. So both sides agreed in December, okay, you have a 3-month grace period, so you don't need those certificates. You don't need to have the vet signing off and everything. And the idea was that the commercial sector, the supermarket sector would get used to the idea, would adapt and make the necessary preparations. But then, because of the Article 16 misadventure, the British government said, okay, right, we are going to unilaterally extend that grace period until October. And they extended some other grace periods and lifted some other aspects of the protocol. So then we get into another situation where the EU took legal action against the UK for the second time, because this was a unilateral move. You're meant to do these things together through the joint committee. And we were back in a antagonistic kind of crisis situation. Now, since then, both sides have been back at the table, having very intense technical talks to try to make the protocol work. On the EU side, they want to make sure that the UK government will implement the protocol, implement what they've signed up to. On the UK side, they want the EU to be ever more flexible and ever more pragmatic about how the protocol works, to basically, as Boris Johnson says, to kind of sandpaper the hard edges of the protocol, knock the barnacles off the hull of the boat, as he colorfully put it. But of course, in the middle of this, you had a sudden upsurge in rioting in Belfast, a lot of different factors. There was the Sinn Féin funeral last summer where the British, the Northern Ireland Police Service decided not, or the prosecution service decided that they couldn't press charges against Sinn Féin. A lot of underlying anger about the protocol, about the Irish Sea border, about unionist identity being undermined. And that, again, has kind of pushed the issue center stage. So what they're doing at the moment to bring this sort of quick explanation to a close, the EU has taken legal action. That's a kind of a process that will happen in parallel. And they did the same, of course, for with the Internal Market Bill of last year. The EU is looking at what flexibilities they can introduce. Say, for example, guide dogs. If you bring now that GB is regarded as a third country, if you bring pets from a third country into the EU, the rules say you need to have a health certificate for the pets. This is to keep rabies out of the European Union. The UK government is saying, hang on a second, we're following the same rabies rules as you guys were up until the 1st of January. Why is it a problem? How on earth could we, somebody bringing a pet from Liverpool to Belfast, how could that be a threat to rabies, the rabies regime in the European Union, which is a fair point. So the EU is saying, right, well, we can find a flexibility around that. We can find a flexibility for certain plants coming into Northern Ireland. We can find flexibilities for animals that or cattle or sheep that go perhaps back and forth. Do they need to be re-tagged every time? Re-tagging an animal costs money, it costs paperwork. So they are looking at ways to make these things a bit easier. But ultimately, the EU is saying, look, if you really want to do away with the vast majority of the checks and controls on the Irish Sea, then you need to align with the EU's food safety rules. The UK, of course, has said all along they would not do that, out of the question. It's a question of sovereignty. The European Union believes that Britain really doesn't want to tie itself to the EU's food safety regime because they want to have a trade agreement with the United States. But I think to bring things up to date this week, what the EU is saying is, look, if you care so much about Northern Ireland, if you think the protocol is so awful, first of all, well, you guys engineered it with us. It's a joint negotiation. You agreed to it. You signed up to it. You're perfectly welcome to align with EU food safety rules and animal health rules, and that will do away with most of the checks. And that's not a problem for Switzerland. It's not a problem for Norway. They do the same thing. And finally, they said you could even do it temporarily until you have a free trade agreement with the United States. Why not align with EU food safety rules in the meantime? In the sense that at the beginning of this year, the UK had already agreed to stay aligned to EU food safety rules for the period of the grace periods, for the duration of the grace periods. What the EU is saying to them now is, look, you might not get a free trade agreement with America for like 3 or 4 years. Why not just stay aligned? And we'll have some kind of EU-UK veterinary agreement, which will make life an awful lot easier. Otherwise, you're just going to get piecemeal solutions, not a kind of a sweeping easement of the protocol. So that's kind of where things are at. Both sides are talking. They're having technical talks. These technical talks will escalate, and then you'll have a more political discussion. But I think overall, people feel that at least the process is on track. At least it hasn't been completely derailed by the Article 16 issue or the question of rioting. And I think it's a good thing because, this is a very sensitive time in Northern Ireland. It's the 100th anniversary of the founding of Northern Ireland. Not everybody is celebrating that. There's a DUP leadership battle on at the moment. That is going to bring about some kind of unpredictable results. So I think both London and Brussels, and I think the Irish government as well, are quite content to keep this process now on a very technical trajectory, in the hope that if it's out of sight and they're talking about boring things like guide dogs and soil and plant health, then that takes the whole identity question out of it. So that's really where we're at. So I'm happy now to take some questions, and I hope I haven't dazzled you all with science or the technical aspects of the Northern Ireland Protocol.
Not at all, not at all. In fact, I keep tweeting out, if only Boris and his and his cabinet had bothered to come to Liverpool 2 years ago, they could have sat in on our conference and they would have known all of this.
Absolutely.
It would have cut out all this problem, because we know that. However, question from Mike Cashman, possibly controversial. Would you agree with this characterization? In 1921, there was an imposed settlement not well accepted. 1998, the Good Friday Agreement, agreed settlement well accepted. 2020, a trade and cooperation agreement and Northern Ireland Protocol imposed settlement, hence does not create an equilibrium.
Question mark.
You know, do you agree with that?
Probably. I have to be uber careful to keep my answers sort of neutral, because I have to remind everybody I'm a reporter, and
Yes.
you know, I don't sort of speak for any sort of side or the other, but I try to just explain what's going on. But I mean, of course, Brexit was enormously disruptive to the peace settlement in Northern Ireland, which wasn't fully mature or bedded down. And, you know, it like the tensions and the disconnect between both communities in Northern Ireland is centuries in the making, and it doesn't go away overnight or even over a 10 or 20-year period. But the problem is that Brexit came along and it just wasn't thought through by its instigators, certainly not from the point of view of Ireland or what impact it might have on Ireland, as I mentioned at the beginning. So this is something that comes across very strongly in Michel Barnier's book. He's kind of saying, look, we didn't ask for Brexit. We didn't have a vote in it. We regret it. We accept it's happened. But it has, objectively speaking, real issues for the island of Ireland and the European border with the UK. So we need to develop, you know, straightforward, pragmatic solutions to make sure that there isn't a hard border. But that's been a huge battle, you know, over the past 4 or 5 years. And I think the view in Brussels is, you know, we're trying to fix the problem that you caused, and you're abusing us for it. That's not to say that, of course, if you're a unionist in Northern Ireland, this is a huge shock and a very distressing change in the status quo. And perhaps there's no point in saying, well, you should have thought of that in the first place before voting for Brexit. The reality is that this is what everybody has to now accustomize themselves to and make the most of it. But I think there are encouraging signs that the British government and the EU want this to work, and the Irish government want it to work, and that if pragmatism can prevail, then the hard edges of the protocol will be sandpapered away, even to quote Boris Johnson, and not forgetting as well that Northern Ireland still has unfettered access into the single market. So there are not insignificant investment opportunities there.
Yes, I think that perhaps had somebody spent a little bit of time just crossing the border or following those border roads from one side to the other, they may have had second thoughts about it all.
We'll never know.
No, we'll never know. We'll never know. No, I say that having done the trail across there to have a look at the ancestors. So yes. Well, I think most of the other comments really kind of would be a little bit putting you in a bit of a spot, and I don't really the other questions, I don't want to put you on a spot.
Well, you mean I'm happy to take questions. I'll try and be careful.
Yes. There's a comment about Theresa May and Boris Johnson being all driven and pumped up by Nigel's right-wing British Empire mentality and treating Northern Ireland and Africa through Brexit. So I think by that they mean it was kind of the old colonial empire idea.
I mean, to be fair to Theresa May, I mean, she did realize that the British government did have a responsibility to Northern Ireland and to the Republic of Ireland as well. She did acknowledge, even though she was at times grudging about it and tried to really push back against anything that would get in the way of her, Brexit vision. But she did ultimately accept that there would have to be some arrangement to avoid a hard border. It was just the nature of that arrangement that she found very hard to accept, but she did sign up to it in the end, and then of course it was rejected by the House of Commons. So,
I mean, there's a couple of questions about the reunification of Ireland. My thoughts on it are, if you look at the reunification of Ireland and you look at the reunification of Germany, seeing as we're going to have a German, a book about Germany later on, are there any comparisons to be drawn or any lessons there? I mean, there was animosity between East and West, but not quite the violence, other than perhaps, shall we say, state violence that was organised. Any comment on that?
Well, it's an interesting kind of, I guess, footnote in the negotiations, the Brexit negotiations. So before the actual withdrawal agreement negotiations began, you might recall that Michel Barnier had to get a mandate from the 27 member states, and actually from the leaders of 27 member states. And when this mandate was being agreed by the European Council, which of course comprises the EU leaders, the Irish government had spotted this German connection, in that when Germany was reunited in 1990, it happened under the Irish presidency of the EEC, I think, at the time, and Germany wanted to make sure that if it absorbed East Germany, that the whole country would be regarded as an EU member. I mean, of course, that was always going to be the case, but in fact, East Germany was so poor that if it had been a candidate country, it wouldn't have qualified for EU membership, because you need a certain convergence. But a compromise was reached under the Irish presidency, and so that meant that all of the new Germany was regarded as a full EU member state. And Enda Kenny, who was a Taoiseach at the time, he wanted something similar to be written into the Michel Barnier's mandate, in the sense that if there was going to be a united Ireland in years to come, that the new unitary state would automatically be fully fledged EU member state. So that would mean that Northern Ireland would be automatically regarded as part of the EU. And I mean, this made some member states quite nervous, because that's a big constitutional issue, and member states and EU institutions, they do not like to mess around with other people's constitutions. But the Irish government did a lot of diplomacy on this, and they got a kind of how would I describe it? I mean, it's kind of like a footnote to the European summit that gave Michel Barnier his mandate, and it acknowledged that in the event of a united Ireland, as provided for by the Good Friday Agreement, Northern Ireland would be part of the European Union. And the Downing Street got wind of this, and they fiercely lobbied to try and prevent that happening. They were making all sorts of phone calls to Brussels, to the Commission, to the European Council. This was in the middle of Theresa May's election campaigns. Remember, she called an election and then lost 30 seats. So this was a very sensitive issue for Britain at the time, but the EU agreed and accepted Ireland's request that it was acknowledged at EU level that if there was going to be a united Ireland, the whole country would be part of the EU. So, but I mean, just in response to your question, I mean, I think the parallels kind of end there. I mean, Germany was, even though there were lots of East Germans who didn't perhaps want to join a new Germany, I mean, it was a pretty seamless arrangement, relatively speaking, whereas the divisions in Ireland are centuries old, and that's an issue that would have to be really carefully managed.
Yes, and one quick last one, and then we'll hand over to Stuart. To what extent do you think that the Brexiteers within the British government hoped or planned for either to persuade or force the Republic of Ireland to exit the European Union in the as a long-term solution?
I mean, probably more than would admit. I mean, certainly there were plenty on the sort of far right of the Conservative Party and UKIP who would very much have loved Ireland to leave the EU, because that would have solved the problem of Northern Ireland at a stroke. And some of the more sort of outlandish commentators in UKIP and the Conservative Party would have been not shy about saying that. And of course, you know, there have been proposals made that, well, there should be, instead of a border on the Irish Sea, there should be a border on the Celtic Sea, so that any goods leaving the island of Ireland would be checked before entering the single market. But that is the same as saying that Ireland would just be kind of a half member of the EU, that Ireland would be some kind of yellow pack member. So that's not a runner. I mean, Ireland did have to do a lot of work in preparation for the referendum in June 2016. There was a whole swathe of government preparation across all government departments, even down to the kind of choreography or the set of Enda Kenny's first statement after the result came in. He was going to stand on a podium with the Irish flag and the European flag beside him, giving his reaction to the result, whether it was leave or remain or too close to call. But the very much the choreography there was to show that Ireland was going to stay a member of the EU, because I think certainly internationally there would have been plenty of countries who would have wondered if Ireland was going to leave the EU as well, because they had a very close trading relationship and a close historic relationship with the UK. But I mean, a lot of the research will now tell you quite clearly that whereas in 1973 Ireland's trade was dominated by the UK, today trade with the UK is around 14%, and most of Ireland's trade is with the single market or America or elsewhere in the world. Still a very important trading partner for agri-food products, for beef, for mushrooms, for a whole range of things, and it's still a real body blow to the Irish economy. But I mean, I think Ireland's place in the single market is pretty solid.
Thank you very much, Tony. I can only give you thanks from us all for honouring us.
Yeah, well, it's a big pleasure. My brother-in-law's from Liverpool, so you know, I was always going to say yes to this. So
I had your arm twisted.
I had my arm twisted. Yeah, I couldn't say no. But great to meet you all, and sorry I can't stick around for more of it, but yeah, I do have to go on television.
Yes,
but,
it's worked out beautifully, because we've got yourself, then we've got Stuart, and then we've got Martin, who will follow, and you've all been given half-hour slots and you fit in beautifully.
Great. So, thanks very much, Mary. Pleasure.